it must share to my something because it always has a share just fairly quickly after I log on. And I think it's sharing mine. Come on, where's Elaine? Kristen. I don't know. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Tuesday Sew Along. Tonight, we're going to be doing block number 24, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Behind me on the wall, I put up a new little project. This is the snow crystals pattern, and I talked a little bit about it last week. It uses the Star 60 tool. You can slit one of the seams and cut a circle in the center and make a nice little tree skirt. Or you can do like I did and just make it as like a table topper. This one is the small version, and there's three size options in the pattern. So that'll be something that I'll probably do as a class here at the shop at some point. So, our classes are available via Zoom and as well as here in the shop in person. The in-person seats are limited, but the Zoom seats are basically unlimited. So we want to encourage you to take a class if you can. Also, last week we had another class of the Feathered Star, and we will be scheduling a couple more sessions of that. Probably won't be till after Shop Hop is over, and it is over on April 1st. So if you haven't been by the shop to get the brochure about the Spring Fling Shop Hop, be sure and check out one of the Spring Fling shops. There's 6 shops this year. This is year 20, so you don't want to miss it. We've got some fun things planned for you. So that's coming up starting 2 weeks from today is the beginning of Spring Fling Shop Hop. So also just a heads up, next week on Tuesday, I won't be having a live video, and we'll pick it up then actually the first day of Shop Hop. Shop Hop for all of the participating shops are from 9 to 5. And so since 5 o'clock is going to be our live time anyway, we'll just go ahead and have a video on the, oh my goodness, I can't remember the date. That would be 21st. So we'll have our next live video on the 21st. So tonight's block is a 4-patch. And we're going to talk about how you can do the 4-patch in a trim down style. We're going to talk about how you do precision sewing to do a 4-patch. And this is just part of the block. The block is actually 4 sections. And so I've got the 4-patch square up tool, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. I've also got my Tucker trimmer down here, and we're going to talk about that. But the 4-patch, the block is named compounding 4-patch because you can also, there's a 4-patch and a 4-patch, and then we're going to be putting together a big 4-patch. So that's why it's called compounding 4-patch, because it's just a 4-patch on top of a 4-patch on top of another 4-patch or within another 4-patch. And I'm going to put them together so you can kind of see what the block looks like. Now, of course, you can arrange your colors to suit yourself. So yours may not look in the same arrangement that mine does. And that's perfectly fine because you get to decide. But we're going to talk about how to make it oversized and trim it down using the 4-patch square up tool. How to make some of them oversized and trim down and then insert them in a cut to size 4-patch. Some people really like to make all of their units oversized and trimmed down. So we're going to start with the bigger one. This is a 4-patch, and it actually consists of 4 3-inch finished squares. So I have my plate ready with my pieces, and I've got some squares cut, and they're actually a little oversized. They're not the size I would normally cut. Normally, if I was making this 4-patch with precision cutting, I would cut 3.5-inch squares of all four for all four corners, but this one is cut just a little bigger than that. So I'm going to show you how I assemble them, how I twizzle the center so I have a nice little flat center, and then I'm going to show you how to use the 4-patch square up tool for squaring that up, and then we'll move on from there. So we got several people from Florida and some from Missouri, and it's always fun to see where everybody's from because I know not everybody who watches is local. And we appreciate our local people too as well. So this is my pieces, and I'm going to arrange it where it's going to basically look like my 4-patch laying here on my sewing area. And that way I can make sure that when I feed it through, I'm going to have my fabric in the color combination I like. So I'm going to start on a fabric tag. That's always a good habit to get yourself into. And I'm going to stitch off of my fabric tag onto my first 2 squares that go in my 4-patch. Now, some people like to do the leaders and enders technique where you make units out of your leaders and enders. I tend to just call it a fabric tag and have a scrap that I sew over and over and over. That's just my personal preference, but if you like the leader and ender technique, you could sure do that. So again, I'm going to layer my pieces here so I know they're going to feed through in the combination in the order I want. I'm just moving those 2 out of my way so you can see and I don't scoot them off the edge of my table. So I'm just going to feed this one through. And notice I didn't cut my thread between my first 4 squares that's going to make my first 4-patch and my second 4-patch because it's always more efficient to assembly line sew if you can. I'm just going to feed this on through. And then I'll grab my fabric tag and, oh, somebody said, I've always heard it called a fabric spider because, you know, it does have a whole bunch of little legs there. And I always have scraps laying around. I'm sure you do too. I just grab a scrap of whatever happens to be close by, and that's what I feed through. So now I'm ready to open this up and sew across the other direction. And I'm going to press, in this case, I'm going to just finger press toward my darker print on both sides. And notice I left that little ladder there. Those are connected because I don't have to hunt for the pieces I need. Now, I could also do some strip sewing. I could have sewn a strip of my blue print fabric and a strip of my blue marble fabric together and then cross-cut it and then trimmed it. And sometimes I do that. It depends on if I'm making a zillion of them or if I'm just making one set. And in this case, I'm just making one set, so I just grabbed my strip and cut it into squares to start with. Again, I'm going to just finger press this. I do a lot of finger pressing. And I've heard these called leaders and enders. I've heard them starters and stoppers. And I just call it a fabric tag. That's just what I've always called it. So I'm going to go right on through. And I am nesting those 2 seams. That's one reason why I take the time to finger press it really well. If I was making a bunch of these, I might take the time to take them to the iron and press them. But often, I just finger press that first set of seams and then take the whole thing to the iron and control it after that. So I've got my 2 4-patches already stitched together. So we're going to go over to the overhead and I'm going to set the iron to heating. So one thing, while you're letting your iron heat up, that's a great time to do your finger pressing. And I want to twizzle that center. So I have to do a couple of things. One is I've got to cut that little ladder of thread that I left. So I'm just going to grab that. I could have cut that before I got up, but I just clip that and then I just twist just a little. What I'm doing is taking out the 2 or 3 stitches that are here and the 2 or 3 stitches that are here on the seam allowance part beyond this cross seam. So I can usually just kind of twist a little bit and those will just lay down nice and flat. And then I hold my finger right on the twizzle, I call that my twizzle, and lay that on my ironing surface and then just real quickly finger press that seam so that it goes the way I want it to go. Once I do that, you're going to see that all of my seams follow each other around the center point. And that's what makes it a twizzle. You can see a tiny little 4 patch right in the middle. I wasn't looking at my camera, so I hope you could see what I was doing. And this is when you give it just a little press. If you're going to use the acorn pressing pin, this is your time. And just give it a little swipe all the way across. And since I didn't do the first seams when I was feeding through just the squares, I actually have the acorn pressing pin go both directions all the way across. And there's my twizzle in the center. I'm going to do that with the other one. First of all, I'm going to make sure that I've got my seam broken down so it'll lay down flat. And I just hold on to that with my finger and my thumb, flatten it, and then finger press onto my ironing surface. And once I get that laying down the way I want it, and the seams are going the way I want them to go to at the very beginning, I don't have to fight them. And I'm just going to give it a quick little swipe. Now there is a trend for a lot of people these days to press their seams open. And you could certainly do that. I tend to press to the side if I can because I find it faster to lock in that seam where it's going to nest. But if you like to press open, that's certainly an option. Now, at this point, my 4 patch needs to measure 6.5 inches so that it will finish at 6. This one's already been trimmed, so you can see it's just a bit smaller. And the way I do that, I'm going to be looking at my 4 patch square ruler, and it has an end that is half measurements and an end that is whole measurements. And you can see right in the middle, the finished size for your 4 patch centers, there's a spot. It's kind of like a bullseye right in the middle that I want this 4 patch to line up with. And I'm going to trim it to 6.5 inches. And when I get that number 6 right on the intersection, I'm just going to line up the 2 cross lines with my seams, and that lines it up exactly where I need it to trim up and over. And notice I've got my ruler laying horizontally on here. If you're right-handed, that's the way you would lay it. If you're left-handed, it would actually go vertically like this and trim up the long side of the ruler. But I am not going to try that. So there's my number 6. That's my finished size, but I'm actually trimming it to 6.5 inches square. And there's a 6.5 inch line on the outside edge of the marked lines of my 4 patch square. So since I needed a half measurement, I used this size. Right here's my finished sizes, and it finishes as a whole number. This side would finish as a 5.5, 4.5, 3.5, and so on. So look for the finished size for the center. So that's the way you're going to use this if you're going to make just a single 4 patch. You cut the appropriate size just a bit bigger than you would normally cut, and then you trim it up. So now let's look at this compounded unit. And it's a little bit difficult to see. I'm going to fold this so you can see just the 4 patch I'm talking about. I'm going to do this 4 patch, the smaller 4 patch. It actually needs to finish at 3 inches. This needs to finish at 3 inches. This 4 patch needs to finish at 3 inches, and this top 4 patch, this top square will finish at 3 inches. So I'm going to first of all start with my small squares, and they're just a bit bigger than they would normally be if I was going to do precision sewing, and I'm going to trim them down. So I've got 2 pale blue, 2 red, 2 of my print, and 2 red to stitch together. So I'm going to take this to the sewing surface. I've actually got more than I need here. I'm just going to sew a couple of them, and I'm going to put aside my extra print and my extra blue ones. And I'm going back to the sewing area. Let's switch cameras so you can see. Now this process is exactly like I just did with the bigger version. This time I'm going to be stitching, I think I put the wrong, oh I didn't. I started to say I put the wrong color down, but I didn't. I'm going to be stitching my red to my blue. Let me bring it out a little bit. And I'm just going to flip it over, line it up, and buddy up those 2 squares and stitch from my fabric tag onto my fabric. Now I'm going to do the opposite combination. I started with the blue on top. Now I'm going to put the red on top. Just line that up. And if you've got more than one to do, it's always more efficient to feed them through together. So I'm going to get the second combination ready. And I've got my print and my sky blue. Nope, I need print and red. I was just about to put that together wrong. I'll show you in here. I knew I put aside the wrong ones, but I couldn't wrap my head around what I was doing. I just got through stitching the blue and the red. Now I need the print and the red. And I was getting ready to put the sky blue with it. This is the combination I need. So I'm going to, again, flip this over, match up the edges. And the nice thing about using the 4-patch square up tool, I don't have to fuss with this to get this to be perfect with my stitching. Although, you know, sometimes we need to slow down and work on precision. Sometimes it's good for us to kind of work on our precision sewing. So I'm going to stitch the second set of squares together. I've laid my scissors down somewhere. And then I'm going to sew off of my 4-patch pieces. And now I'm going to stitch across. And this time I'm going to press toward my red fabric because I've got red in both of my 4 patches. So if you have a constant color, in this case it's this red print, I'm going to always choose to press toward that if I can. So I'm going to just buddy those up, and I can nest them. I can feel them with my fingers. If you feel it necessary to pin, you certainly could, but I try to avoid that if I can because it saves a little time. Plus, if you're not careful with your pinning, you can actually distort. Some things you have to pin just to be able to make sure everything lines up the way you want it to. But I tend not to if I can get by with this. So I'm just going to give this a quick little finger press toward my constant color. In this case, it's red. And buddy those up together and nest the center and line that up. And I just leave my ladder stitch right across there. That way, it keeps my 4 patches organized in the combinations they need to be able to put them together later. So stitch off of that 4 patch onto my fabric tag, and now we're ready to go to the ironing board. And again, we're going to twizzle. Let me switch cameras so you can see this. Now this one, I still have one that I haven't trimmed, so you'll be able to tell really quickly. If I tried to put this in my block, you would find out very quickly it's not right because it would not match up with this one. So that's one way you can check yourself to make sure that you have got it trimmed to the right size. So I just twizzled that a little bit. You won't be able to do it if you leave that ladder thread connected. So you have to get that disconnected. So I'm going to open this up, and I put my forefinger and my thumb right on that center and flatten it out on my ironing surface so I can make sure that it lays down flat. And it makes a nice flat center. And I often stack up my units like this. If I have finger pressed it, I'm not having to use the iron to nudge the seam allowances the way I want to go. I've already got the seam allowances controlled and going the way I want them to. So we're just going to give that a quick little swipe and put the iron on it long enough to flatten it and dry up that acorn pressing solution. Now I'm ready to trim. Let me get rid of these so I don't trim something I didn't intend to. So now this unit needs to finish at 3 inches, which means I'm going to trim it to 3.5. So I'm going to show you a couple of options. So there's my 3-inch mark right on the center, and I would put that intersection right on the center point. That's my bullseye. And I'm going to do it with this one so you can see they both are the same size. So there's my number 3. Line it up right on the center seam and the center point, and then line up these 2 guidelines on my 2 seams. And then I would trim. Now I want to show you, if you haven't purchased the 4-patch square up yet and you want to try this method, grab your Tucker trimmer. So this intersection where the 3 comes across and forms an X, that's your center point. No. Let me trim that to 3.5. I was getting ready to trim that wrong. And I didn't hear anybody screaming, telling me you're putting the wrong thing on there. 3.5 inches is the size I want to trim to so that it will finish at 3 inches. So I'm trimming to a half measurement, but its finished size, of course, is a 1/2 inch smaller than that. So there's one turn, and now I'm going to line up the edge where the 3.5 inch line is. I still have that same cross section. Now the thing about doing this, I have that diagonal line, but I don't have a straight line that lines up right on the seam. However, I do have one that's parallel to the seam, so I can tweak it and check to make sure that I'm centered on there and I'm straight before I line those up. So that is one way to trim that if you want to do a trim down. So this needs to be 3.5 inches so that it'll match up with these 3.5 inch squares that form the oversized and the compounded 4-patch. So I have a 4-patch inside a 4-patch inside a 4-patch to make the whole block. This, of course, needs to be trimmed. And if I'm using the 4-patch square up, I'm going to be looking for the number 3. That's my finished size of my unit. Line up the lines on the seams, and I would trim up and over. And again, since I'm right-handed, my tool is laying here horizontally on my cutting area. I'm going to turn, and this time I've got the 3.5 inch line. That's the cleanup line here to make sure I'm straight. My number 3 bullseye's right on the center of my 4-patch, and I can line that up. Now, these 2 units, my smaller 4-patch units, are trimmed to size. These are not oversized, so I have to match these up, and at this point, you would want to make sure that you sew and do your best sewing to make those match. So let's go back over to the sewing area, and I want to show you a couple of things you can do to make sure they work together. Now, one thing that you want to be aware of when you put these together, your constant color, in my case it's red, needs to meet in the middle so that you have a little diagonal arrangement of your contrasting color. So I've got my print and my sky blue opposite each other, and I have my red constant color in the center meeting the 2 plain red squares. So when you do that, this is a test for you. If you're stitching and this square doesn't match this square, you've got a problem, and you need to fix that before you move on. So I'm going to line those up and I'm going to check it. If they do not match, I've either trimmed inappropriately, I have not sewn, or I've cut my plain square the wrong size. So you want to check that out. Now, something I tend to do when I'm feeding through fabric, I'll take 3 or 4 stitches and I'll stop with the needle in the down position. And that's a good way to be able to handle your fabric, manipulate your fabric. And then I'm going to make sure that where I'm getting ready to stitch, the end of that seam, those corners match up. And I can hold on to those as it feeds through so they don't separate. I know you've probably stitched something that matched when you held it up, and then when you got to the end, the bottom has separated and it's fed through faster than the top. So when you're doing that, sometimes if you're watching the final corner, I'm going to call it right here, you can control that. I'm just going to stitch this through, get it where it's under the needle and controlled, and then match up the final corner where you're going to be stitching so that you can make sure they feed through evenly. Now, if you happen to have a machine that has an even feed system, this is a good time to engage it because that will help that situation where they stay together and they don't separate. Because your feed dogs pull your fabric through, and often your presser foot, if you're not careful, pushes your fabric and they separate. But if I'm looking at this, and I actually cut the ladder thread so you could look at it, I've got the edges are matched up, which is what I want. I can finger press this, and I would finger press this toward my constant color again so that I can nest the center, line this up, and now that would be where I'd stitch. It's possible to stitch it this way. If you do, you're going to be unsewing if you want the block to come out the way to look like the picture. But right now I have this seam pressed toward my big square of red, and this seam's pressed toward the big square of red. I can nest them in the center, and again, I would match up the first corner that I'm going to stitch through and stitch through 3 or 4 stitches and stop. Then I would make sure I'm matched here. And I don't worry too much about the final corner yet. I'm concerned about this center, that they're locked together and nested. And I'm just holding my finger on that as it feeds through and letting my finger follow the fabric. And once I get to there, then I leave the needle and I match up the final corner. But again, if I have not cut properly or trimmed properly, they won't fit without a ripple that I don't want. So do be aware of that. So I'm ready to take this to the iron and press that. Again, here's where I would twizzle that center, and I just take out 2 or 3 stitches just by twisting. And then I'm going to hold my forefinger and my thumb right on that seam and set it down. And of course I would actually do this at the ironing surface and just finger press it. This time the seams are going this direction around the center. So it just kind of depends on where you start and how you start by pressing. But that's the basic process for making the 4-patch. I'm trying to find my mouse. It's disappeared. There it is. So I would take this to the ironing surface. I would press this, and then let's check it. I don't want to be real heavy-handed with my iron. This is where a lot of people distort their blocks because they just saw all over their unit, and then they're surprised when their edges are not straight, because you can distort the edges of your unit by being too rambunctious with your ironing. But if these 2 blocks don't match, I need to probably check and see if I have taken a big enough seam, if I have cut something improperly. But this will match up here in the center. I put my print in the center, and I've got one more somewhere. Here's my other one. This is the way I'm going to arrange my block. But you may decide to assemble your block in some other manner, that's totally fine, but mine's going to have a red chain down the center. It kind of disappears right here where the red is together in that bigger 4-patch. I call that a double 4-patch, but that is certainly, you have the option of making that a different size. Now, if you do not get the handouts via email, let me know and I can add you to our email list. Also, for some reason, I was having trouble again getting the YouTube video to load up. I finally got it done today. I don't know what they've done to Facebook that it doesn't want to let me download my video, but I think I've got it figured out again, so maybe I can do it faster this week. So watch us on YouTube, invite your friends to join us, and come by and see us. Don't forget to come by and get your passport for the shop hop 2 weeks from today, and visit the 6 shops. And you have 10 days to visit them, and then you'll be eligible for the grand prizes, and we've got some nice prizes. So be sure and come see us. Until then, happy sewing.